rule against Trump are part of a judicial insurrection. You know, is the average person who actually thinks Stephen Miller is not full of crap going to understand the difference between the different judges who are against Trump? I don't think so. And I think you're exactly right that they're not thinking about the long game here, that the more they're eroding credibility in the lower courts, what they're really doing is eroding the credibility of the federal courts at large. Part of why I think it's a real problem that the court hasn't stood up for the lower courts whose rulings have been defied. Part of why I think it's a problem that the court hasn't, or at least Chief Justice Roberts hasn't spoken out more publicly, at least since last March, about the attacks on specific judges. I mean, there's this effort upwards to try to impeach two federal judges for rulings basically just that the Republicans disagree with. And so, you know, Mark, I think it's all of a piece, which is that the Supreme Court somehow thinks it's good to all shifts and pressures and tensions. And I'm very worried about it.
So I'm going to date myself here a little bit. I graduated law school in 1993, and at that point I had a pretty good sense of what it meant to be a conservative Supreme Court justice. It was something between number one, originalism, protectionism versus living constitutional modern protection. The second was sort of the strong bias towards states and all these cases. You know, does the minimum wage apply to state governments? Does it, you know, can states do this? Can states do that? Like, sort of very strong sort of federal constitution. I'm having a hard time trying to figure out whether there is any jurisprudential to the current law, or whether it is, you know, much more idiosyncratic to who is before them, what they think the outcome should be, who they think should win, who they think should lose. You know, I have a lot of people on who are very cynical about the Supreme Court. I am moderately cynical about the Supreme Court, but I'm curious, like, what you make of it.
It's a deep question that I don't know that there's time enough to fully flesh out. But here are a couple thoughts. I think the first is, you know, the court said they, not it. And I think there's a real difference here between the two blocks that I think are often not the same on these issues. The Thomas Alito Gorsuch block on the one hand, and the Roberts Kavanaugh Barrett block on the other. I think there's a real argument to be made that Thomas Alito, and more often than not Gorsuch, really are voting almost straight line for Republicans. And, you know, maybe they're coming up with reasons why they could do that, but, like, you know, some of the cases where they're in dissent are, and nobody else is, are really striking on this point. I think it's a harder call for that sort of median block, for the Chief and Kavanaugh and Barrett. Not because I think, and the irony is I actually think, we tend to think of Thomas as having these deeper commitments and these more consistent principles. I actually think it's the other way around. I think it's the sort of the moderation relative to Thomas Alito and Gorsuch of the Chief and Kavanaugh and Barrett that's doing a lot of work here. And I think, you know, that's a very different median on the court than the O'Connor-Kennedy-Rehnquist median that you and I spent so much of the early parts of our careers right dealing with. Part of why it's different is because I don't think they have the same deep commitments to particular principles. I mean, O'Connor, whatever else we say about O'Connor, she was a devout states' rights federalist, which, you know, led her to a lot of rulings I didn't agree with, but actually you could predict her votes in those cases, even when it was a blue state versus a red state. There's less predictability from these justices, which I think is part of the problem. And again, it circles back to why it's even more incumbent upon the court to try to assuage people like you and me that there's real principle here. I guess the short answer is, I really do think that this court, at least, you know, 6 of the justices are still doing something that can reasonably be called wrong. You know, it may not be the law I want them to be doing, their lines might not be where my lines are, but, you know, I think Trump's going to lose, for example, the Lisa Cook case. I think he's going to lose the birthright citizenship case. You know, I think the tariffs case will be closer. That's not a court that's wholly in the bag for Trump. That is a court that is just, you know, more committed to at least this particular view of executive power that I'm comfortable with. But I still think that the alternative is worse.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you on 2 of those 3. I view the Lisa Cook case differently. Because there is not a principled distinction other than there are justices that don't want to see the stock market greater, the bond market greater. Like, you tell me, you probably know the merit of the market there. Why is the Federal Reserve of all agencies? I mean, after all, the FTC was literally the agency that
I am not defending. So I think that for me, I think the court had already crossed that line. And so to me, the Lisa Cook case is not about the independence of the Fed. The Lisa Cook case is about whether the president can make up the cause.
Interesting.
Right? That to me, the court has already basically decided, wrongly, but decided. In the Slaughter case, right?
Which is the FTC case I was mentioning.
The FTC case. One, they're getting rid of Humphrey's executor, and two, they're carving out the Fed for, as Justice Kagan put it, bespoke reasons, where neither of those prongs make sense, right? I'm with you 100%. But in a world in which you have any independence, and I think more than one, that independence would be pointless if cause meant whatever the president said. And if there was no opportunity on the part of the person who was fired to challenge the grounds on which she was punitively being removed. And so that's why I think the Lisa Cook case is, the court actually doing law. And it's part of why I think the oral argument went the way it did on Wednesday, because at least for, again, that median block, the Chief and Kavanaugh and Barrett, it would be nuts to have a legal principle, maybe you and I don't buy, that the Fed is uniquely independent, and then not be able to enforce that principle even against the president they otherwise are generally willing to.
I gotta ask you a couple of follow-up questions around the premise of this that I actually am very interested in your opinion on as a constitutional professor. The first is, do you think there are any? No, not sure. Do you think under the Supreme Court's current announcement, is it bespoke of one, or are there other bespokes?
I think it's a class of one until we find a second.
And the reason I ask you is, what do you do with an agency, and I obviously have a sort of a parochial interest in this, so I'm picking your brain here for free. You have the Federal Election Commission, which was designed...
I had a hunch that's where this was going.
Yeah, that was designed by Congress. As people who don't know, the Federal Election Commission regulates campaign finance. It regulates spending of money in connection with federal elections. And it has a very specific history, which is that it's set up as a 6-member body where the agency cannot act without the commission. It actually doesn't even matter if there's fewer than 6 commissioners or 5 commissioners. Still can't act without the commission. And the reason for that is that no one party can have more than 3 members on the commission. We set up specifically to be a bipartisan body that could not act without some bipartisanship among the commissioners. I understand you may think there's an argument because you agree with the underlying premise that there should be independent agencies, but in the handing out of bespoke tokens, do you think that that's the kind of thing that conservatives would find persuasive, or like those kind of agencies fall also?
Nah. But I think the real sort of nail in the coffin for me was when the court just grouped together the National Labor Relations Board and the Merit Systems Protection Board in the Wilcox case. Because to me, Mark, the MSPB was actually a great sort of small example that is not the same structure as the FEC, but it is a sort of analogous idea.
It's very similar, yeah.
Right? Where the MSPB does not wield executive power. It exists for the sole purpose of resolving internal employment-related complaints within the executive branch. There's no universe in which it would make any sense to have an agency with that function that was politically accountable to the president at will. The lower courts actually thought you could distinguish the MSPB from the NRB, and the court just pushed them in. I don't buy the ground on which the Supreme Court claims that the Federal Reserve is bespoke. It isn't. The historical claim is false. The analytical claim does not actually distinguish it from so many of these other agencies. But this is the justice. This is the court we have. They just sort of wave their hands and stuff. And I think that gets back to this larger problem, which is that this court, more than any court I am familiar with, just doesn't think it has to be especially persuasive. It just thinks it has to, write something that sounds superficially plausible. It's like the Fox News version of constitutional law.
No, it's funny you say that because I didn't agree with most of what Justice Scalia wrote, who is viewed as the forefather of conservative jurisprudence. But there were a couple of opinions that have always stuck with me. One is Doe versus Reed, which was a case out of Washington State, and it had to do with whether or not people have a right to sign petitions anonymously. And he held that they didn't. And in so doing, he was actually very much siding with the progressive side of the argument, the people who wanted to get access to these petitions. See, the names were opposing an anti-gay marriage initiative. So, he was very principled, and it followed an earlier case that he had been in dissent in out of Ohio, which dealt with anonymous leafleting. He had a jurisprudence that basically was like, you don't really have a right to anonymity in political activity. That the Federal Election Commission could require you to disclose your name. The state of Ohio can require you to disclose that you handed out these leaflets, and the state of Washington could turn over the name that you sold as a different say, that there was no right to a private secret ballot originally in the country, and that that's Congress could do away with that, or states could do away with that. He was very rhetorical in the way he approached it, but there was a force to how he did it. It was not kind of like a mile wide. And I agree with you. There is something about a lot of these more recent opinions that you're just kind of left feeling like you've eaten a meal and you're still hungry.
I was thinking about this. I was teaching in my federal court class the Boss case. I know you know.
I want to talk about it.
And so,
introduce me to the Boss case.
So Congressman Boss, and I think there were 2 or 3 other plaintiffs.
From Illinois.
Right, from Illinois. We're challenging Illinois' rule allowing the counting of certain lines of mail-in ballots. And the lower courts held that they didn't have article standing because they couldn't actually show that they were going to be injured, right, by the rule until we had an election. Right? It's possible. The lower court said, it's going to be a huge margin. You're not going to actually win or lose by that much.
In fact, Boss
won by a lot.
Has won historically by very high substantial margins.
Where every single time they were all so in the normal case, you and I would think that means he doesn't have standing. And a lower court.
In fact, my law firm submitted briefs at all levels of the court saying exactly.
And the Supreme Court said 7-2, although with an asterisk that we'll get into, that he does have standing. But there's this narrower concurrence in the judgment by Justice Barrett, joined by Justice Kagan, that says he has standing because he himself has undertaken all of these additional expenses to bring this litigation, to prepare against the possibility that he loses an election based on his count, like pocketbook information that's classic. And what's really striking is, with Barrett and Kagan's the majority still went further and said, no, he doesn't even possibly standing. All candidates have enough of an interest in, sort of fair election and a fair election process that there's automatic candidate standing to challenge any government county. So from the perspective of the court's Article 3 jurisprudence, that's totally insane. I wrote a post by newsletter about how it's remarkable that candidates have special standing rules of legislators. Until you win, but the larger problem is so categorically unpersuasive. And it's a John Roberts opinion, and Roberts is usually he's the best writer on the board. Yeah. And so, it's striking to me that these big cases we're getting over and over again are almost like they're writing to convince the choir. And not actually writing to persuade anybody who isn't already on the team. And I think that's only doing more damage, right, to the notion that the court is doing something other than winners and losers. And I think that part of how we're doing is important.
There's one, first of all, the opinion is very right-coded. Yes, it in theory should be celebrated by everyone who represents candidates, and I represent a lot of candidates. But you read it, and it reads. There's a lot in there about election integrity, and like it is not written for a bipartisan choir. Let's put it that way.
No, and I go even further, just to say, what I thought was the most striking part of the Chief's opinion is where he says, this rule will